I will tell you a story that was buried in silence for centuries. A story hidden beneath cathedral stones, locked away in dusty archives, and smothered by the fear of the Inquisition. It is a tragedy that the chroniclers chose not to write, for it revealed not only the cruelty of men but also the corruption of the institutions that claimed to guard faith and morality. This is the story of a child who was never allowed to remain a child, a girl who carried within her a secret that the world wished to erase. It began in a forgotten village of medieval Castile during the final years of the 13th century. The place was small, scarcely more than a cluster of stone huts crouched beneath the shadow of an aging monastery. Life there was harsh, marked by hunger, superstition, and the ceaseless whisper of the church's authority. In that world, children grew quickly, for innocence was a luxury few could afford. Among the children of this village was a girl named Ysabel. She was no more than 12 years of age when her fate began to unfold. To the villagers, she was an ordinary child, thin, dark-eyed, with hair as tangled as the forest paths. She tended sheep, carried water, and sang old lullabies that her mother had taught her. But in her simplicity and innocence lay a vulnerability that would make her the prey of those who cloaked their desires in piety. The monastery that loomed over the village was no sanctuary. Within its walls lived not only monks but also men who bore the insignia of the Inquisition. They claimed to watch over the purity of faith, to root out heresy, to punish witches and unbelievers. But they also watched the people of the village, judging their every movement, every word, every silence. To disobey was to invite suspicion, and suspicion often led to the pyre. Ysabel's father had once been accused of keeping forbidden books. Though nothing was ever proven, the shadow of that accusation never left the family. It was enough to make them vulnerable. And when a family is vulnerable, the powerful may take what they wish. At the age of 12, Ysabel was summoned to the monastery under the pretense of service. The church requires a maiden to tend to the kitchen, to sweep the cloisters, to wash the linens of the brothers, the village priest had said. For the family, it was both a curse and a blessing. To refuse would be to risk suspicion. To obey was to place their daughter in the hands of strangers whose power was absolute. No one in the village questioned it. A child was offered to God, they said. It was holy, but holiness in those halls was a mask. Behind locked doors, behind the chants and the incense, something darker lived. Ysabel discovered it too late. In the beginning, she was treated kindly. Bread, better than she had ever tasted. Wine, forbidden to her before, but now given in small sips. Gentle words, promises that she was chosen, that she was special. And then came the nights of silence, the footsteps in the cloisters, the shadows that entered her chamber. She was 12 years old, and she did not understand what was being taken from her. By the time the seasons had turned, her body began to change. The sisters who occasionally visited the monastery whispered behind her back. Her belly swelled, her face paled, and the secret that should never have existed grew heavier with each passing day. She was no longer a child, yet she had never been given the chance to become a woman. She carried within her a life, one that condemned her as surely as if she had spoken heresy aloud. The Inquisition could not allow such a scandal to be known. A child, pregnant within the very shadow of the church, was not merely a shame, it was a threat. It revealed hypocrisy too great to be borne. And so they did what those in power have always done. They silenced her. But the silence did not erase the truth. For when Ysabel gave birth at the age of 13, the story could no longer be contained. Whispers spread among the villagers. Some said the child was the spawn of a demon, others that Ysabel herself had been bewitched. The monks declared that she had seduced a servant of God, and that she was guilty of sin beyond forgiveness. It was easier to condemn the child than to admit the corruption of the holy order. Her parents were forbidden to speak. The infant, born pale and frail, was taken from her arms under the pretext of being baptized. Ysabel never saw it again, and yet, as she lay weak and broken in her bed, she swore she heard the cry of her baby echo through the monastery halls, only to be cut short by silence. The church recorded nothing. In their chronicles, no such girl existed, no child had been born, no scandal had ever threatened the sanctity of their cloister. But among the villagers, the memory remained. A girl of 13 who had been both bride and prisoner, both mother and victim. A girl who had carried within her the weight of a crime committed by those who wore the robes of faith. I have told you the beginning of her tragedy. But this is not the end. What followed was darker still. For Ysabel's suffering was only the first act of a story that would reveal conspiracies, hidden heresies, and truths that the Inquisition fought to bury beneath fire and blood. The child bride of the Inquisition had been forced into silence. Yet centuries later, her voice still calls to us from the shadows, and I will follow that voice deeper into the labyrinth of secrets they tried to erase. I promise to follow the voice that still moves through the dark corridors of that ruined monastery, and so I did. Centuries have passed since the night when the infant was carried away, yet the stones remember. The wind that slides along the cloister remembers. Even the dust that sleeps in the cracks remembers. What the chroniclers chose not to write. The walls continued to whisper in a language of scratches, stains, and scars. I learned to read it slowly, as a blind reader with a patient finger. What I found was not a single truth, but a web, and it had been spun with great care. The first strand was a ledger, sealed with blackened wax and hidden inside a hollow beam above the sacristy door. It was discovered during a restoration long after the monastery had fallen into disuse, when a carpenter's chisel split the timber and spilled out brittle parchment that smelled of smoke and bees. The ledger belonged to a lay brother named Martin, a quiet scribe who noted everything that others wished to forget. He wrote of sacks of grain, of rents from fields, of payments to traveling preachers, of candles spent during vigils for unnamed souls. But between those ordinary lines, Martin tucked small, deliberate hesitations, as though the pen itself had paused to listen for footsteps outside the scriptorium. In one entry, dated to the year after Ysabel's child was born, the scribe recorded an expense for linen sufficient for a christening of necessity, followed at once by a purchase of pitch to seal a box. There was no name, only an initial, Y, interlined and then scraped thin with a knife. That scraping seemed to me louder than any flourish. Another page listed a payment to a midwife from a neighboring parish, a woman called Aldera. A final note about her said only that she no longer presents herself, and that her portion of bread was reassigned. That is how monasteries record the disappearance of people, as an adjustment to the bakery's output. Secrets do not survive on paper alone. They require accomplices, or else they rot and crumble. I began to see the shapes of the accomplices in Martin's margins. He marked certain entries with a faint symbol that looked like a coiled serpent biting its tail. The symbol did not belong to the order. It did not appear in any book of saints or sins. It was a private sign, a thread that bound together names which otherwise had nothing to do with one another. The cellarer who allowed visitors to enter after sunset, the cantor who suppressed a hymn under pretext of doctrinal doubt, the village priest who reported gossip with unusual zeal, the steward of a nearby noble household who suddenly owed no more rent. It was the serpent that led me to the second strand of the web. Tucked into the ledger was a loose slip of parchment, creased many times and patched with a wafer of brown wax. On it was a list of items to be moved from the monastery treasury to the episcopal residence in the city. A silver pyx, a reliquary with a shard of bone, 2 chests of accounts, and the swaddling of a holy innocence. That phrase was too pious, too theatrical, to be anything but a disguise. When I pressed the slip to the light, I saw that a word had once stood between holy and innocence. The letters had been vigorously scraped away, but the shadows remained. I traced them with a stylus and felt them rise like bruises. The missing word was living. The living innocence. Not relic. Not swaddling. A living being that needed to be removed like a treasure. The ledger did something else, quiet and devastating. It unfolded a story of a marriage that never was. A single folio bore an imitation of a marriage contract, with Ysabel's name inked in by a careful hand. The groom's name was nothing but a formal placeholder. Dominus nomen nescio, a legal ghost whom no one had ever seen. Dates mismatched. A seal had been impressed twice, as though the first attempt had slipped. This was the invention of a bridal veil after the child had already been taken. It was a cloth thrown over shame, a legal screen set before an empty altar. It declared that Ysabel had been a wife, not a captive, that what had happened to her had the blessing of consent and ritual. That is how institutions wash their hands. They convert wounds into documents. Yet Martin, who had the habit of recording what should not be recorded, left one more message. It was not obvious. He wrote an inventory of the monastery's library, and in that inventory he repeated the first letter of each line with a peculiar insistence. When I copied the first letters down the page, they formed a sentence in Latin. Pater est prior. The father is the prior. It was a confession that could not be written plainly and could not be spoken aloud. It was also a light that changed the shape of the room. Once the sentence existed, every shadow matched it. If the prior was the father, then others must have known. The village priest who had brought Ysabel to the monastery did not do so innocently. The cantor who silenced a hymn did it to smother a rumor that equated the cry of the newborn with the cry of a martyr. The cellarer who received visitors after sunset admitted a messenger from the episcopal palace on the very night the child was baptized and disappeared. The steward who no longer owed rent had offered hospitality to a foundling placed in the home of his lord. The serpent passed from one hand to another, a whispering bracelet. There was more than paper. There were the objects that paper pretends to describe and cannot contain. In the crypt beneath the chapter house, near a damp corner where a carved angel has lost its face to time, a wooden doll lay buried in salt. The doll's surface was cracked and pale, and its belly opened on a hinge. Inside I found a scrap of cloth wrapped around a hair ribbon and a tiny roll of parchment. The script on that roll was cramped, hurried, and written by a hand unaccustomed to letters. It was Ysabel's hand, or the hand of one who wrote for her under her breath. The message was brief, and even now it shakes me to repeat it. She wrote that the man who came to her chamber never spoke his name, but wore a ring with the serpent. She wrote that she scratched the serpent's tail with a pin to make it bleed, and that the same ring had later touched the forehead of her child at the font. She wrote that when she cried out, she was told that a marriage would cleanse the stain, that a groom would be found among pilgrims, that a veil would cover all. The veil was never meant for her. It was meant for the eyes of the world. The scrap ended with a description only a grieving mother would keep. The infant had a mark, a small crescent of pale skin near the left shoulder blade. It was not a stain of sin, nor the touch of an angel's finger. It was a birthmark, crescent and delicate as a moon in a shallow pool. If ever she saw that mark again, she promised, she would know. You may say that a birthmark is a fragile thread with which to tie together a secret that powerful men have pulled apart, and you would be right. Yet threads matter, especially in a tapestry woven to confuse the eye. The mark reappeared where no one expected it. In the inventory of alms recipients for the bishop's household, a child is listed as found in swaddling, placed in the kitchen, moved to the steward's suite. A year later, the same child is described by a physician who notes a lunar brand upon the left shoulder blade and prescribes a poultice of herbs to quiet the child's wheezing. The physician's note bore the faint snake, drawn as a flourish beneath his name. If I sound certain, it is because the pattern repeated in too many places to be an accident. The prior, protected by the prestige of sanctity, took what he wanted and called it providence. His brothers closed ranks. A bishop collected silence as if it were coin. The noble household received a foundling who would grow up believing herself blessed by charity. The midwife vanished. The scribe grew careful and then died, leaving his ledger behind like a bottle dropped into the sea. The serpent stretched. It rounded the circle of the village, the monastery, the palace, and the manor. I did not trust my own conclusions until I found the serpent carved in stone. Beneath the prior's seat in the chapter house there is a panel of wood with a shallow niche for a foot. The wood rotted long ago. In the rot a thinner plank had warped and fallen inward, and behind it, on the stone itself, someone had cut the serpent in profile. The tail was scarred, a single nick exactly where Ysabel said she had scratched the ring. That nick was not an accident. It was a signal to the few who knew. It told them that the circle was closed, and that any attempt to break it would draw blood. I stood there for a long time, listening to water drip in the crypt, listening to the hush that lives after confession. The ledger, the false marriage, the doll, the physician's note, the mark on the stone. Threads pulled from different corners, brought together to shape a single figure. Not yet complete, not yet named in full, but undeniable. The truth was not merely that a child had been taken and another invented to explain it. The truth was a fraternity that bent law, ritual, and memory in order to preserve itself. They called their circle obedience. They fancied it order. It was neither. It was fear, dressed in authority, crowned by a serpent. I tell you this so that you may understand the hunger that moved me forward. I had followed the voice into the ledger and the crypt. I had seen the serpent and the crescent moon. I had touched the wax that sealed a lie. But I had not yet learned what became of Ysabel after her child was torn away, nor how the foundling's path crossed the ambitions of men who measured salvation with iron. And I had not yet opened the one door that still waited in the dark. A door to a room whose key was bone, not metal, and whose hinges were greased with vows. Behind that door lay letters written by a pen that never confessed, and a truth that, once spoken, would call down not only the shame of those who built the circle, but the wrath of those who inherited it. The door was there all along, behind the altar, where the serpents on the capitals do not bite their tails but watch the steps with lidded eyes. I had the ledger in my hands. I had the doll in my pocket. I had a name not yet voiced. I breathed, and the dust breathed back. Then I moved toward the door, and the silence gathered like a cloak. The door behind the altar did not open easily. Its wood was swollen with centuries of damp, and its hinges groaned like the throat of something long buried. When I pushed, the air that escaped was colder than the crypt below, as though it had been sealed not only from the light of day but from the very rhythm of time. Dust swirled in slow spirals, and my torch painted trembling shadows on the wall. What lay beyond was not a chamber of prayer but a vault of concealment, a sanctuary not for the faithful but for silence. At first glance, the room seemed empty. Bare stone walls, uneven floor, no altar, no bench, no relic. But silence has a way of deceiving the eye. The chamber was not meant for worship, it was meant for erasure. On the far wall stood a set of shelves, and upon those shelves, a row of clay jars sealed with wax. Their lids bore marks scratched in haste, not the solemn seals of the monastery. Each jar was labeled with a letter, not a name, and each jar contained ashes. I took one down. The wax cracked, and inside, amid gray dust, lay the charred fragments of parchment. Ashes of documents, burned deliberately, perhaps in fear of discovery, perhaps in obedience to an order from above. Yet burning does not always destroy. I sifted through the gray with careful fingers, and from one jar I recovered a strip of writing that fire had only blackened, not devoured. Its words were Latin, hurried, jagged. The girl is not to speak of the father. She shall be named bride to cover the sin. The child is to be marked and hidden. The serpent was there again, drawn faintly in the margin, a habit that survived even the fire. The ashes had preserved not only fragments of orders but also fragments of conscience. I realized then that this room was a graveyard of evidence, a chamber built not to guard but to destroy. And yet, destruction is never perfect. Shadows always escape. Behind the jars, half buried in dust, I discovered a wooden chest, small and bound with rusted iron. Its lock had long since corroded, and it yielded with a sharp pull. Inside were objects pitiful and damning. A length of veil, yellowed and stiff, embroidered with the faded emblem of the serpent. A wax seal, broken, bearing the mark of the prior himself. And wrapped in cloth, brittle with age, a letter written in a hand that trembled. It was from Ysabel. Her words were brief, as though written in haste and hidden before she could be silenced. She wrote that she was forbidden to cry, forbidden to speak of the nights that had stolen her childhood. She wrote that her belly was called a miracle by those who had caused it, and that her voice was called heresy when she tried to protest. She wrote that she was promised a wedding but given a prison, that she was promised mercy but given chains of silence. At the bottom, smeared in ink that had run with tears, she wrote, "If my child lives, find the crescent. It is the truth they cannot burn." The crescent, the mark on the shoulder of the infant, the crescent moon she had described in her earlier scrap. A mother's last thread of hope, clung to even when all else was stripped away. But the chest contained more. Folded among the relics of deceit was another letter, not by Ysabel, but by the bishop himself. His script was sharp, precise, unyielding. It commanded that the scandal be contained, that the girl be silenced, that the story be reshaped. He wrote of her not as a soul, not as a victim, but as a problem. "The serpent will protect its own," he declared. "The child will be remade in obedience, or extinguished." That single word, extinguished, hung in the air like smoke. It told me what the ashes in the jars truly were. Not just burned parchment, but perhaps burned testimony, burned identities, burned cries of those who knew too much. This chamber was not merely for paper. It was for people. And then, in the deepest corner of the room, I found what turned suspicion into certainty. A stone slab had been loosened, perhaps in haste, perhaps by decay. Beneath it, bones lay scattered, small and delicate. The remains of a girl, no more than 13 years of age. The bones bore marks of binding on the wrists and ankles. Around the neck, a rusted chain. And upon the ribcage, still clinging though centuries had passed, a strip of cloth embroidered with a name. Ysabel. It was not death that silenced her. It was the Inquisition itself, cloaked in robes of holiness, that ended her voice. She had given birth, she had cried out, she had begged for mercy, and for that she was buried not in the churchyard but beneath the stones of silence. Her existence was reduced to ash and secrecy, her memory condemned to be erased. Yet one thing they could not erase, the child. For in the bishop's letter, among the words of suppression, lay a note of fear. He wrote that the infant had been spirited away to a noble household, under the guise of charity, but that the crescent mark would one day betray the bloodline. He warned that if ever the mark was seen by the wrong eyes, the serpent would be undone. And so he ordered that the child be raised in ignorance, never told of her mother, never told of the circle that had stolen her life. Thus the serpent protected itself not only with fire but with lies, weaving new lives out of the ashes of the old. I closed the chest with trembling hands. The air in the chamber was thick, heavy, suffocating. It was as though the centuries themselves pressed upon me, demanding silence, demanding complicity. But I could not be silent. The truth was too heavy now to remain buried. I left the chamber of ashes carrying Ysabel's letter and the veil with the serpent. As I passed through the cloister, I felt the eyes of the carved saints watching, their faces eroded, their mouths sealed. The monastery had been built to stand forever, but its stones whispered guilt. Ysabel was gone, her voice extinguished, her body bound and discarded beneath stone. But her child lived on, hidden among the nobility, marked with the crescent, a living testimony to a crime that the serpent had tried to erase. The question that remained was not whether the child had survived, but whether she had unknowingly carried forward the very bloodline of the men who condemned her mother. For if the serpent had hidden the infant in the household of power, then the circle had not ended, it had expanded. And the shadow of Ysabel's tragedy had stretched into the very veins of the realm itself. The conspiracy was no longer about a girl and her stolen child. It was about the legacy of the serpent, buried in bloodlines, entwined with thrones, reaching across centuries. And I knew then, the final truth, the last revelation, would not be found in ashes or bones, but in the living heirs who carried the crescent. The discovery of Ysabel's bones and the chamber of ashes was not the end. It was the beginning of a revelation that reached far beyond the ruined monastery walls. For when the serpent bound her wrists and silenced her voice, it did not realize that the life torn from her arms would one day speak louder than any chronicle, louder than any sermon, louder than any flame of the pyre. That voice lived on in blood, in breath, in descendants who bore the crescent mark upon their flesh. I followed that mark through the centuries. The ledger, the bishop's letters, the notes of the physician, the inventory of alms, all pointed to a single noble household into which the child had been placed. The house was powerful but not royal, wealthy but not untouchable. Its fortunes rose after the year Ysabel died, as though favored by providence. In truth, it was favored by silence. For the foundling girl, Ysabel's daughter, grew up within its halls, her origins erased, her name remade. She was baptized anew, christened with a name chosen by the bishop himself, a name that erased the memory of Ysabel. She was told that she had been abandoned at birth, a nameless orphan rescued by the mercy of the church. No mention of the cloister, no whisper of the serpent. But her body carried what no lie could erase, the pale crescent upon her left shoulder. Servants saw it. Physicians noted it. Her foster mother dismissed it as a quirk of nature. But the bishop and the prior feared it. For they knew that if the truth of her bloodline were ever revealed, if the world learned that the daughter of the Inquisition sin lived and thrived, then the entire serpent circle would be broken. So they tightened their control. They ensured she would marry into another household bound by debt to the church, strengthening the bonds of silence. They ensured her children would be raised in obedience, unaware of the ashes beneath the monastery. But blood does not obey silence forever. The serpent thought it could bury memory in parchment and fire, but memory lives in rumor, in song, in the way servants whisper in kitchens. I found in an old ballad, sung by peasants 2 generations later, the tale of a maiden with a crescent birthmark who was said to be the daughter of the moon, hidden by priests. The ballad had no name, but its melody lingered in the countryside where Ysabel's village had once stood. It was the people, not the monks, who preserved her truth in fragments of rhyme. And then, centuries later, in the archives of a noble family descended from that household, I found a portrait. The canvas was cracked, the colors faded, but the subject's face was clear. A young woman of high birth, clad in silks, with eyes dark as Ysabel's had been described. And on her bare shoulder, half concealed by fabric but unmistakable, the painter had left a pale crescent. Perhaps he had not meant to show it. Perhaps he thought it decoration, a touch of grace. But it was there. The crescent had not vanished. It had survived. It had passed from Ysabel's stolen infant to heirs who walked in courts, who spoke with kings, who influenced the fate of kingdoms. The serpent, in hiding the child, had seeded its own undoing. For now the blood of Ysabel lived not in silence but in power, hidden in plain sight. And the truth? The truth was this: entire dynasties carried within them the mark of a girl the Inquisition murdered. Kings, queens, lords, bishops, unwitting heirs of a crime committed in silence. The serpent had thought itself eternal, but it had bound itself to blood it could not erase. I stood in the ruins of the monastery, holding Ysabel's letter in my hand, and I understood at last why the Inquisition burned so many voices, so many women, so many innocents. It was not only to preserve the purity of faith. It was to bury their own sins, to drown the cries of those they had used, broken, discarded. But fire cannot consume memory forever. Ashes whisper, stones remember, blood carries truth. I imagined Ysabel, 13 years old, alone in her chamber, clutching her infant before it was taken. She could not know that her words would survive, that her crescent would become a symbol, that her story would one day be told. She could not know that centuries later, her descendants would sit on thrones, command armies, and be praised as chosen by God, even as their blood carried the mark of the crime the serpent tried to erase. That is the final irony. The Inquisition silenced her, but in doing so it gave her voice to history itself. The serpent carved in stone still lies beneath the prior's seat, scarred where Ysabel's pin drew blood. The circle is unbroken, but cracked, and through that crack, light seeps. I leave you now with her truth, that beneath the grandeur of cathedrals, beneath the crowns of kings, beneath the robes of priests, there runs the blood of a child bride of the Inquisition. Her tragedy was buried for centuries, but no silence is eternal. The crescent moon rises still.